Hello, this is Alexandra, Talty environmental journalist and host of South Fork Sea Farmers. I am here with Michael Wright, reporter and columnist at 27east.com, Express News Group. And today's show is From Fall to Winter, Changing Seasons and Phenology. Now, Mike, everyone knows your column.
I don't even know what phenology means.
Well, you're definitely, okay, you are definitely in the phenology world. It's like how things change over time. And I think your column in the field has been really impactful for fishers out east for many years. So how long have you been at the press? I feel like you've been such a mainstay there.
23 years at the press as a reporter, almost 24, will be 24 this March, and I've been writing that column since, I think 2005, maybe 2008, I think 2005. So coming up on 20 years of that also. And it used to be weekly, it's now bi-weekly. And yeah, that's not really my job. My job is actually covering news stuff. Everybody thinks, oh, you have a great job, you write about fishing, but that's not actually my job. That's just a sort of a side hustle.
Yes. I feel like you always have the juicy stories, like all the political intrigue and really important ones. I always feel like I see your byline
Well,
there.
in East Hampton, because I'm a one-man band here for the most part.
And that's such an accomplishment, though, having a column for like 20 years. What have been some of the things that have changed over time since you started it?
Oh, we've seen a lot of changes in fish populations and the ups and downs of how fishing goes in our neighborhood. Lots of good, lots of bad. Striped bass populations through that stretch pretty much since 2005 have gone from being the best they had been in generations after having been very bad for many years when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s. They had come back in 2005 to 2012 or so. Striped bass populations were just enormous, and now they have declined steadily since then and are in a really sort of hazy place right now with a not very bright future, at least on the foreseeable horizon.
And can you explain that a little bit? Because I know out here, folks have been seeing great fishing from the beach.
Yeah, fishing's great right now. Yeah, the fishing's been great for the last 5 weeks, and that's just one of the things about where we live, and same, just the whole New York Bight area. It is sort of like the bottleneck in the striped bass migration, which the vast majority of striped bass are born and raised in the Chesapeake Bay and go back there every winter to spawn. The Hudson River is a big one, but those fish don't go up there in the winter. They stay out in the ocean in the winter, and off the New York Bight is really where they hang out. And so they move through here in the fall, then go up and spawn in the rivers and come back out in the spring and move back through here again. So we see pretty much every fish in the striped bass population. So it can seem like there's a ton of them, but what you don't see is the spread of them that you used to in the further back into the bays in the summertime. There's places that used to have fish all year, and now you just see them for a period of several weeks or a month or so, in the spring and then again in the fall. And that it's different here and there, and it can be, for people that aren't paying very close attention, it can seem like everything's hunky-dory. But there's scientists that do population surveys and spawning surveys, and they can show that there's not very many fish in various size classes, which are year classes they call them. And so they know when you're going to have like a big gap, and we have two big groups of fish. So there's a whole lot of really big fish, and then there's a whole lot of like middle-sized fish, which are the ones that people are allowed to take home for dinner. And so everybody's catching fish and having striped bass for dinner nowadays. And they think that's great, but those fish will both dwindle, and then you can start to run into periods where there just aren't very many at all, which it's what we had in the 80s and 90s. I don't think anybody thinks that we're back to that in the very near future, because that was really bad, but it's not going to be good probably in another 5 or 6 years. But
And
we'll see. Things can change.
Is the Chesapeake a big indicator on that?
Yeah, the Chesapeake's where they do the main, more than half the striped bass population on the East Coast, which basically only goes from like northern Carolinas to Maine is the range of striped bass. They don't have striped bass south of the Carolinas really. So the Chesapeake is where more than half of them originate. The Hudson River is the next biggest spawning stock, and their stock's doing okay. They're not gangbusters, but they're doing all right there. It's been better. A lot of it's warming winters related. There's the Delaware River has a spawning stock. The Kennebec River in Maine. There's some rivers in Nova Scotia that actually have very big spawning stocks. But yeah, the bulk of it is the Chesapeake, and so the most important indicator of how striped bass are doing is the Maryland Department of Natural Resources annual Young of the Year study, where they basically just put nets across the mouth of the rivers that the striped bass come out of, and they see how many little ones they catch, and that's just how statistics work. They do samples of that, and they say we only caught an average of 1 per net this year as compared to 11, which is actually what it was last year. The long-term average is 11. They've had years where it's like 20, and this year it was a 1, which means
So that means
basically there weren't any.
these fish in 5 years, this class is not going to be a
Right,
good
that
class.
mean, right, those fish, right, exactly. Those fish would be expected to start spawning in about 8 years, and they'd be about 28 or 30 inches long. And so, yeah, that year, those fish just aren't gonna exist. And now, I mean, the way that, striped bass spawning works, I mean, we got back to where we were in the late nineties and early 2000s from a stock that was just decimated and down to tiny fractions of what it is now, because a few fish can rebuild the stock if spawning conditions are right for them. If the spawn survives, it doesn't take very many fish to rebuild very quickly. But that hasn't been happening lately, largely because of environmental factors. Most people think.
And is that kind of where the saltwater fishing license idea in New York is coming from, or is that unrelated?
No, I mean, they're not really related, other than that, the fishing license idea, which is something that's been kicked around for a long time and, is a revenue generator, basically. One of the things that you would use money for is improving environmental habitat for striped bass, which obviously New York State would be on the Hudson River. There's certainly things that could be done up there. You can clean water discharges into the river. The big thing in the Hudson is all the legacy pollution up there, which I think they've sort of decided the best thing to do is just to leave it
Cement it,
undisturbed.
yeah.
Exactly. You don't want to stir it up. And that, that's a fight from the 80s. The striped bass thing is, the spawning problems, some of it is pollution related probably, but mostly it's just the fact that they've found that what makes for a good spawn is a very cold winter and then a very rainy, wet spring. And we just don't have cold winters anymore. I mean, we haven't had one since 2015, which uncoincidentally is the last time there was a really big striped bass stock. And if you don't remember, we had a really cold winter in 2015. It started a little late, but it lasted later than, I think one of the baymen told me it was the latest that he'd ever seen Peconic Bay still frozen, still locked up frozen. It was all the way into like late March. And that year you had a huge striped bass spawning success. And pretty much 2016 and 2017 it was okay. It wasn't great, but it wasn't abysmal. But then since then we've had 5 years of just basically non-existent spawning, and also no snow, no cold, no ice. It just hasn't. I mean, the average temperatures are in the 40s in February. It's it's just not. If you need cold, we're not getting that anymore. So
I think actually the press did a story where, and if it was yours, please tell us, about like the ice fishing they like just went through all the records of the ice fishing club.
Ice boating, yes,
ice
right,
boating,
yes.
sorry.
Right, with Chip Marin, who I've seen on your show, congratulations to him, just got elected trustee in Southampton. I think he's fantastic, and I think he'll be a great trustee. But yeah, that was ice boating on Mecox Bay. That was in 2017. I did that story.
Okay, that was yours.
And yep, and it was and that was the first year that Tom Halsey, who was 77 at the time, I believe, hadn't gotten his ice boat on Mecox Bay in his entire life, and he has not since then.
Wow.
Which is a sad state of affairs. And there's a whole bunch of those guys, Chip included, who have they have those ice boats in their garages, under tarps, and have not been used in years. And that used to be a big thing. I live right up the street from Mecox Bay, and I remember when we were in high school in the wintertime, that's what you did. And those boats would be out there for a month or two at a time, and it was kind of one of the play. Everybody gathered there. You went there after school, and the guys ice boating were ripping around, and everybody else is hanging out drinking, hot chocolate and stuff like that. They got beach chairs on the ice, and it was a real community. I mean, they had an ice boating club. It was like a yacht club, but just ice boating. And yeah, that's gone. That doesn't happen anymore. There's a kid whose name I forget, who's from Southampton, that's like a really, really good competitive ice boat racer. But he has to go to, Wisconsin and stuff like Michigan to do that now, because even on the Hudson, they don't really get, the Hudson used to be one of the meccas for ice boating in the whole country, and they just don't really have ice on the river anymore.
Yeah, it's so crazy. And I think those kind of like physical reminders of how things are changed, because it's, with environment, they always say it's like the moving horizon line. Like you don't notice that this year to that year is that different. But then when you're looking at something like, oh, every single year the ice boating club like opened at a different time, and then and now it just hasn't opened at all.
Yeah. One of the things that that I thought was interesting that Tom said back then was that, he pointed out that even in like 2015, which was a cold winter, they didn't have great ice boating. He would get out, like I said, he did it every year of his life, but he would get out when nobody else did, because he was gutsy and would ride the ice, slush ice
also
along
very tall
the edges. Yes, right, exactly. And so, he was on the fringe of what most people were doing. But what he said was that what happened is that, you started, even when you would get the cold winters and you would get ice, it didn't come until later in the year, and so the ice would never get thick. The pond might freeze, but you need 2 or 3 inches of ice for them to be able to reliably, put all that kind of weight on it. And so when it doesn't start freezing in December, or the water doesn't start getting really cold in December, you never get that thick ice that builds up and has the whole pond locked up like that. You get surface ice, but you don't get that really thick ice. And so, some of those really cold years they got out in February and March, but other than that, it wasn't like the long season like they used to get. And that certainly holds true. I mean,
Yeah, I remember
December, you play golf more than you see ice.
Yeah, definitely. I remember always ice skating on Old Town Pond.
Yeah.
And I don't think like anymore now, if it is cold enough to ice skate, it has to be like Mill Pond in Watermill, because it's shallower.
Yeah. Right. And Old Town. I mean, they've skated on that, I don't know, maybe once or twice in the last 3 or 4 years, but and it's short, It's like, for maybe a week you get some ice that it gets a little thick enough for people to skate on and that sort of thing, but
not what it used to be. And so speaking of how it used to be, scallop season just started this week. Thoughts? I think you were covering it.
Yeah, I was down at the bay on Tuesday, seeing people were doing it. Some people found them in Southampton town in a couple of places, not very many. Not good. I mean, obviously the scientists that are surveying everything, and the baymen that do it too. A lot of commercial baymen didn't even go Monday and Tuesday because they just knew that there weren't many. My one friend who is a commercial bayman from East Hampton, who went in the water off Sag Harbor, got 2 bushels, which for a bayman is not that. He's just giving that away to his friends. He's not even bothering to sell that. It's not worth the effort probably. But there'll be some in East Hampton when that opens next week. Probably maybe a little bit of a commercial market.
More in East Hampton than in.
Yeah, I think there's just a couple of places where they've done better. In East Hampton, in general, the water's a little cooler. You know, a big part of the problem is the waters are warm, and East Hampton gets that ocean flushing, and you know, there's a little more deep water and kind of places that you know just out there further that don't get quite as warm as like the Peconic Bay up around Riverhead and Flanders, which really is the home of the Peconic Bay scallop. And you know, it gets so hot up there now. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. And do you, so like I think the scallop is something that's always like every year. It's like, is it gonna in the summer? There's like
Yeah.
reports about it.
Yeah.
How is it trending? Would you
Oh,
say?
it's been terrible for 5 years now. It was trending up, like 2012, 13, 14, 15. And then it started to go down gradually, but you know, generally the population was big. I mean, not quite what it was, you know, prior to the 1980s, but it was big. I mean, over 1 million pounds were caught in 2014 and 2015, I think. And then in 2019, there was this massive die-off that nobody saw coming. 95 or 98% of the adult scallops died, and actually not even just that nobody saw it coming, everybody thought it was going to be a gangbusters year, and it ended up being just a horrible year, and it's been the same every year since then. And that's same thing there. They discovered, you know, there was obviously like an all hands on deck thing with every marine biologist and scientist on the East End after that happened.
And we have quite a few out here, which is
And
one
we do, and we have the best ones, you know. I mean, because they've had to rebuild the bay scallop stock before when it was decimated in the 80s and 90s by the brown tides, and basically they brought it back from the brink of you know, maybe not really extinction, but commercial extinction anyway. And so there's a ton of people that know a whole lot about them, and you know, they've been working hard on figuring it out, and some of them are optimistic that they're sort of finding paths, you know, that might get them back on track, and you see, you know, they can start rebuilding again, you know, back to square one. They're not an easily defeated bunch, you know.
That's what's funny about, I mean, there's a few things I think are interesting about scallops. Like, first of all, the short lifespan, right? So it's something you can harvest that you don't have to feel bad about, you know, that you're depleting something. But then also, you know, it's been really hard for people to figure out how to farm them as opposed to like other kinds of shellfish.
They're fickle, they're temperamental, they don't farm very well.
I think there's like one in Cape Cod that's been successful commercially, but I know Cornell was doing like some studies with it here, but it hasn't really.
Yeah, there's some small scale stuff. I mean, there's the Kim Tetra's wife. I think,
through this, it's a spat through like the.
Well, yeah, he does the spat, but is it his wife? I shouldn't be saying, but there's somebody that grows them and sells them commercially up on the North Shore. Who is it?
Karen Rivara?
Karen Rivara, that's right. Greg Rivara's
Greg
wife.
Rivara's wife.
Right.
Okay.
Apologies, Greg and Karen.
This is what's good when you have a good audience that knows their stuff.
Exactly. So yeah, but they haven't been. I mean, the hatchery guys have done a you know, yeoman's work trying to get them released into the wild, and that's been difficult enough as it is. And you know, as they've said, the closer they are, like literally by vehicle, from where they hatch them to where they release them in the bay makes a big difference on how many of them survive, because they're tough.
Really?
Yeah, that's why they're so delicious, right? They're delicate little flowers, and
they are, and they're so cute with the blue eyes.
Yeah. Yeah, I was down at the bay the other day with a 7-year-old girl who had never been scalloping with her dad, and you know, their friend was showing her the eyes and how it, you know, it claps like that and spits the water, and she was fascinated with it.
Yeah. So, do you think there's hope there, or?
Sure, why not? There has to be hope, right? Because you know,
and
Mother Nature, you know, figures that stuff out.
Yeah, and it does feel like there's so many people that are working on it, you know, and I think also with like the eelgrass restoration and things like that, that has to.
Yeah, I'd love to see eelgrass restoration be a big success also, and that stuff's all tied together. You know, they're finding different ways. The clam thing has worked so well in Shinnecock, and the Stony Brook guys have a lot of great research going, and the hatcheries in East Hampton and at Cornell do such great work that there'll be ways to figure it out again. I mean, they have bay scallops in freaking Tampa Bay, so the things must
So that's
be able to
gotta,
live in warm water somehow.
but they're not as tasty, probably.
Probably not.
That's what we have to
Probably
say,
not.
being from Long
I
Island.
would think the same with oysters from anywhere south of the Hudson River.
You had a recent column where you talked about Sag Harbor, like, used to being a fishy place.
Yeah,
Can you talk
yeah,
about?
Sag Harbor used to be. It used to be such a great fishing mecca, There was a lot of great fishing around Sag Harbor and flounder fishing in particular. And flounder fishing's just, ended basically everywhere on Long Island and in most of the Northeast, frankly. That used to be one of the great fisheries out here, that it started in March and it was something you could do from shore, and
Yeah.
it was in shallow water in the bays, and the fish were delicious and there were tons of them. And, it was a big thing for people that grew up out here and lived out here, and that just kind of basically went away also very quickly. Just a matter of maybe 10 years, it went from abundance to non-existence for all intents and purposes. I mean, I haven't caught a flounder in probably 15 years, and that was a big thing in Sag Harbor. They had a derby there that people came from all
Yeah, I
over to
didn't know
fish
about
in.
that. I do remember
It was
flounder is like the first
huge,
fish that
and
I
people were
caught.
fishing all up in Sag Harbor Cove. People had their spots. They had, people all along the wharf, along the docks. It was a big thing, and then that just ended, and they stopped the derby. I mean, nobody had really participated in it enthusiastically in years when it finally ended. And Peconic Bay used to have great fluke fishing in the springtime. That's gone away for who knows what reason. The fluke population is not really down, but it's shifted a little bit. Seems mostly more north and east. And the Sag Harbor fishing just hasn't been as good in the last several years as it had been. And the tackle shop that was there, Kenny's Tight Lines Tackle, which used to be Bayview Tackle, it was shared a storefront with a seafood shop for years, which was such a great little small town thing. And he closed up and moved to Southampton Village, which those of us that live in Southampton Village are celebrating. But it's kind of sad for Sag Harbor in a certain way, kind of another one of those things. I mean, there's still fishing to be done in Sag Harbor. It's just that you're going to Montauk to do most of it. And good bass fishing in the spring and big bluefish and stuff. The Ferry Slip is still a striped bass spot, but not what it used to be, really.
And I also think something happens too when like you lose the kind of infrastructure. Like, what was the tackle shop like right over the bridge going from from Southampton to East Hampton, like over the canal?
Alton Kirk's,
Yeah.
yeah, which they just tore down and built houses on top of.
Legendary
exactly.
place.
Legendary place.
Never would have
Literally
thought.
in the I wrote a column about that back when it first got proposed, that you had all these Hampton Bays residents who flipped their lids over the proposal that they were going to tear down the Canoe Place Inn, which was at various times a brothel and a speakeasy and a hotel and a trashy nightclub, and everybody said, "Oh, you have to save this historic place." And so the guys that owned the property and owned the Alton Kirk's property said, "All right, fine. Well, we won't tear that down and build condos there. We're going to build them over there." And so they tore down the Alton Kirk's building, which literally was one of the pioneering sites of big game fishing in all of the United States, actually in all of the world. In the 1950s, that was an auto repair store that Mickey Altenkirk's dad operated and made fishing tackle. And then Mickey Altenkirk, who was the father of the last owner, Hank Altenkirk, was one of the most brilliant and ingenious big game fishing tackle manufacturers. He built the best rods that people from all over the world wanted, and he would take the big game reels that people were using and made them so much better. He was the only one like manufacturing his own drag washers and altering these reels to make them capable of catching the huge tuna and big swordfish that we had here that people were just starting to realize were fun to catch and pursuing. and they had a dock behind that was where the first boats that ever went to the canyon tuna fishing, and the first guys that went over the horizon without any electronics and stuff like that, were based out of. And, nobody gave that any historic, thoughts, and it got torn down about, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago now.
Yeah, but that's
Kind of
so,
depressing.
that is different.
Especially for me, because I grew up there, like literally grew up there. We lived in Shinnecock Hills and, snapper fishing on the canal. I was allowed to even, back then, parents weren't so freaked out about kids going off on their own. Even when I was like 6 or 7 years old, I was allowed to get on my bike and ride my bike to the canal. But I had to go into Alton Kirk's and call my mom from there and say, okay, I made it to the canal. And they knew that, Hank and Mickey and Rich Parrison and Dave Warson and Jim Taylor, who I just saw the other day down at the bay scalloping, were there and were paying attention to who was fishing down at the canal and that kind of thing. And that if anything was wrong, I could go run into them crying, and that, I would get home safe. So, that was really a place for so many of us kids that, that was the tackle shop back then, and that's,
Sounds
that
like
was sort
you
of
should
sad.
start the museum, I think.
What museum?
For Alton Kirk.
Oh,
at
and
the
Alton Kirk's
canoe
museum. Well,
place
Hank's
in.
got the museum of Alton Kirk's is in Hank's house. He's got a spectacular folders of photos from back in the 50s and 60s, and he's got all the rods that his dad and reels that his dad built back then. That he saved all that stuff, and he's mostly retired, but he still builds some rods here and there and sells them online. But there's a great treasure trove of big game fishing history in a basement in Hampton Bays.
Well, hopefully someone does something with that.
Yeah,
I think.
that'd be nice. That he should. I mean, there probably is some of that stuff at the IGFA museum actually in Florida, but yeah, he should make sure that stuff is archived properly when he's moving on.
Just tell him that. Call him up. Be like, speaking of,
Oh, I've
we've
told
been
him.
thinking.
I've
oh,
definitely
that's
told
good.
him that. Yeah, right.
And
I'd love to have them, Hank. No, he won't see this, but
And speaking about like big game fish, I know one thing that is always a topic out here, and I'm sure for you as a journalist, it is sharks. And I know there's been proposals now to limit shark catching on Long Island. If you could talk about that a little bit.
yeah, from the beach. I mean, you're basically not allowed to harvest the most of the sharks that people really used to fish for back in the day. Mako sharks, which were delicious. I remember John Ducks always had Mako shark on the menu. You don't see
Wow.
that ever anymore. It was a big thing. It was like a favored delicacy back in the day, and it is. They're delicious. But yeah, you're not allowed to fish for them because their population had a big collapse after having collapsed and then come back, and the Mako fishing was really good for a while, and then they've collapsed again. And so there's no Mako fishing allowed. You're still allowed to catch threshers, which are similar in meat. I think you are. They may have stopped that too. I'm not even sure. But really what's caught on in the last several years is fishing, because we have so many sharks on our beaches now because of the bunker thing. Which you've seen in the news, and people getting bit and this whole thing. They call them shark attacks when they're really just shark bites. But
I love that distinction.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's so like
Yeah.
for people in this world, they totally get it. But if
Yeah.
like to explain that to like a recreational bather,
Right,
like
right.
the difference
It's
between
tough. Yeah.
I think most people they hear shark and they're like, okay,
Yeah.
I don't want.
Yeah, right. You don't want to get bit by them, whether it's an attack or a shark. That's semantics. It doesn't matter. They both suck.
Yeah, but it does seem. I mean, we had a show recently where we talked a lot about the sharks and bunker and all of that, and I understand why people are scared, but I also think, and I feel this as a person in the media, and maybe you do as well. Like, I think there's also like a disservice to the public that's happening where there's so much focus on them,
Yeah,
and not
yeah.
actual real information.
Right. Well, yeah, and a lot of it, does get sensationalized. And I mean, not to say that telling people that people got bit by sharks is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's not like it's causing a stampede. It's not a fire in a movie theater kind of thing. It causes some headaches for local lifeguards and that sort of thing, who now have to be, on this hyper vigilance for watching out for sharks that have never bitten anybody out here. And And then the state spent all this money on helicopters and planes, sort of like,
And it's
as though
so,
if somebody in a helicopter saw a shark, they were gonna be able to tell it not to bite the person swimming, It was, there's certain conditions, and, there's been some good advice put out because of it, because of the several bites that, there were a handful this year and a handful 2 or 3 years ago. And, they saw very quickly that they all came in the same conditions, when people were swimming in cloudy water in a place where there's bait around. And, you realize that that's just a shark who's swimming around, he feels something in the water, something flashes before his eyes, he smells bait and he bites it. And oops, it was somebody's foot or hand or arm instead of a bunker. And, you know, you can tell people just not to swim in those conditions, and the lifeguards do that when the ocean is like that. And, that when those bunker schools come in really close, they keep people out of the water, which, that's a minor inconvenience, so it's not so
and
horrible.
yeah, and I also feel like, I mean, there's other things besides sharks that can bite you. Like, if there's a bunch of fish jumping in the water, that doesn't feel inviting.
Yeah, there was a great, I wrote an article actually, probably many years ago, 10 or 12 years ago, about some people that are a couple of surfers that had reported getting bit by sharks, and it turned out that it was actually bluefish.
Yeah, I feel like that's the typical.
Yeah, which, I mean, wasn't super common, that does happen, not probably quite as much, but just because, you don't get bluefish roaming around in that muddy water, that was like surfers that like kind of paddled over to a blitz of bluefish, and, were surprised that
Sounds
their
like a
foot
surfer.
dangling in the water got bit by a bluefish, so.
Yeah, when
Minor stuff.
Brad Peterson was on and he gave some tips. It was like, don't go in the middle of the fish if you're surfing and have your feet flop around that
Right,
look exactly like a
Right.
bunker.
If you saw a bunch of tigers, feeding on antelope, would you go jump on the antelope's back? It's that kind of thing.
So speaking of bluefish, you said that they are back this summer.
They were back this summer, big time, yep, they've been gone for a long time, it's been probably almost 10 years since we had lots of bluefish around. And they had been on a slow decline for a long time, and then they largely vanished. I mean, for a lot of surf fishermen, that was kind of like good riddance, because they destroy your fishing tackle, they're a pain in the ass, we like catching striped bass, and so it's, you prefer not having bluefish around. And a lot of people were like, yay, the bluefish were back, until they caught 2, and then they were sick of them again already, so. But, it's generally just a good thing, just like sharks, it's a good thing to have, an ecosystem that has all of that stuff in it. And, a balanced ecosystem is a better, a healthier one, so. There were a lot of bluefish this year, not, what it used to be, we're not back to having the big blitzes on the ocean beaches in the summer, but there were a lot, we're still waiting for them, they're in the bay still somewhere, they're gonna come down the beach here in the next couple of weeks, and we should be seeing there were some huge bluefish in Gardner's Bay just last month.
Like how big?
Like, 15, 18 pounds. I mean, I heard that somebody caught like a 20 or 21 pounder, I think up on the North Fork someplace, which those are very big for bluefish. Bluefish, I think the world record is like 26 pounds, and I think like maybe there's been a couple that were bigger than that caught commercially, but any bluefish over like 15 pounds is a really, really big bluefish. When I was in high school, I worked on the Viking, and we fished at night out at Cartwright's when there were no striped bass in those days, so you went night blue fishing. And in the fall was the gorilla bluefish, and we used to get 18 and 20 pounders from time to time. And those are big. I mean, that's a big, mean, heavy fish. They're cool.
I feel like I feel like part of the reason why people don't like them though is they don't like to eat them. Like some, but I think it can be a really good fish if prepared the right way. Like I feel like,
well, listen, if you're over the age of say 40, you grew up eating bluefish because there were no striped bass to eat back then. So you ate bluefish. When I was a kid, we lived in Shinnecock Hills. And in the summertime, when you had guests and you wanted to have fresh fish, you got in your car and you drove out to Montauk, and you took the kids and went swimming at the Montauk Down swimming pool, because it had diving boards in those days, including an Olympic-sized like 20-footer, which you can't even imagine the insurance company allowing that now. But they had the 3 diving boards, so you went and you did that, and then at 4 o'clock you went down to the docks by what's now Salavars, I guess Salavars then too, and you bought a big bluefish like this big right off the back of a charter boat that had gone out and caught more than the people on board had any interest in, and the mate would sell it to you, clean it for you, and you took it home and you cooked it, and there was a big old sloppy bluefish fillet like this big. I mean, it was caught that day, but it was bluefish, and so that's just what you knew eating. I mean, my mother cooked it on a broiler until it was well done. It was just awful. Thinking back now, but we didn't know any better then. That's all. It's what you ate, right? So nowadays I wouldn't eat one of those. Their cheeks are delicious, but those big ones, a lot of people smoke. But like a 2 or 3 pounder, I still love those. My mother-in-law begs me to bring her one every time she's here because the little ones are good and they're great. It's a nice white flaky meat. You gotta like fish. That's all.
Yeah, I've had a chowder before. That was really good.
Really?
Yeah.
That was probably smoked too, maybe not. Maybe
I don't know. It
poached
was
in lobster stock or something like that.
maybe it was at the powwow. It was
Yeah.
from the Mashpee Wampanoag.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but it was very delicious.
I have a cookbook called the Bluefish Cookbook. That's
Oh,
always,
really?
it's just dozens of recipes of, ways to cover up the taste of bluefish.
Okay, I might
basically.
hit you up for the chowder because ever since
Yeah.
I've had that one, I've not been able to make it, and I tried to get the recipe anyways.
I had a friend who just moved out of town who used to always smoke them, and we would go in the spring and down at Girard Drive where they have a big run in the spring, and we would each catch a whole bunch of those big ones, and you'd cut the cheeks out and eat those, saute these in a pan because that's some of the best seafood out here, and then we would smoke the fillets, and you made like dips, and you'd freeze them and eat them. It's as good as smoked salmon or smoked trout any day of the week.
And so taking a step back and kind of looking at these things that have happened over, your lifetime and the kind of horizon line of the East End, what are some things that are you feel good about with like all of these changes on the water?
Well, I mean, there's some fisheries that are as good now as they ever were. Tuna fishing is way better than it ever was, which is great. I mean, I love tuna fishing, always have, and you used to have to go 100 miles and go to the canyon overnight to even have a hope of catching a tuna, and even that 20 years ago, if you caught 5 or 6 30-pound albacore, which are not the most sought after of the tunas, you thought you had a great trip. And nowadays you can catch yellowfin tunas up to 100 pounds, bluefins 200, 300, 400 pounds. You can see the beach. They're right on the shore, and there's tons of them, and that's good. And maybe it's anomalous with the bluefins. It's probably just sound management. They had been way overfished by canning nets back in the 70s and 80s, and it just took a long time for them to recover. And so there's just tons of them now, and the fishing is spectacular. I got a friend that caught 3 that were probably all over 700 pounds, like
Wow.
within 10 miles of shore on Sunday. And I hooked one on Sunday on a little striped bass spinning rod that I had no chance of catching. That was probably a 200, 300 pound fish also. And that was not even 2 miles from the beach in Sagaponack. So that's great. The striped bass fishing, at least we know that it can come back. It's not very hopeful, but it's very good. There's a lot of big fish. Fluke fishing is generally good. That's showing some signs of trouble. There's black sea bass. There's plenty of good fish that if you like to eat fish, you can catch around here. And if you just like to catch them, if you're willing to put in your time and you're savvy about it, there's plenty to catch. So there's some, there's still plenty of fun stuff to do around here. The waterfowl hunting isn't what it used to be, and but some of that stuff will come and go, and things could change.
Yeah, and I think things also always do change. So, we don't always have to look at it so negatively, I guess. I think earlier before we started filming, you said that you used to take this week off to go scalloping.
Yeah, this
and
was my favorite week of the year. Because, right, scallop season started, and the black fishing was always good, and the striped bass were running, and pheasant hunting, which, that we just don't have because we built houses on all the fields. But, yeah, first week of November used to be like the best week of the year, in my eyes anyway.
Oh, I like that. And when's the last time you took the first week off?
Oh, it's been several years now. I can't think. It was the last time there was a big scallop stock in Napeag Harbor, so probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago.
And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I know you've been covering the Lazy Point homeowner story of like beach erosion and hardening of shorelines. Because I think it's something that I think you have covered a lot of these stories and seen how like regulations have changed and the kind of mix of homeowners and environmental concerns and then municipalities. And I also think it's something that we're gonna see, like, I think New York in general, we're obviously like susceptible to these big storms. They're they're supposed to be happening more according to the scientists. So what do you see happening with this and like how do you think, like, what direction is it going in?
Yeah, lazy, well, I mean, the whole.
That's a
Shore,
specific.
shore hardening in general has been such a big deal out here because, it causes all these problems. When there's a storm and it's reflection and, if one guy hardened, there was that famous case back in the
Yeah.
nineties with the guy in Bridgehampton that put the geotubes. That was the first time anybody out here heard about geotubes. And it caused all this damage to his neighbors' properties. And the same thing with seawalls, is that you can build seawalls and yes, they protect a property, but if they end somewhere, when you get to the end, it magnifies the damage done to those properties. And you've seen that in a few places, in Watermill on the other side of the Mecox Cut. And so, seawalls became this horrible thing that everybody wants banned. And, on the ocean, that's sort of one thing. On the bay, it's another, because the ocean beaches sort of come and go. And when they're hard, even where there's a seawall, yes, it causes these problems. But then in 2 years, you don't even know that seawall's there anymore because it's buried under
Yeah.
a mountain of sand that just came in there naturally and rebuilt.
I always think of
And-
the one at Wyandanch. Like
Right,
sometimes
right,
when
the
it's,
Wyandanch-
that's always a good
The
indicator.
Wyandanch one, the one at the end of Flying Point Road, which right now, in fact, for the last 5 years, you wouldn't even know was there. And it's a huge wraparound seawall that fronts 4 properties, and you just don't even know it's there. But before that, there were 2 or 3 years where, it was fully exposed. And sometimes there was one year where the cut got out of control and, it just washed away all that sand, which is why that wall's there in the first place. So yeah, seawalls are complicated. There's some people that say you can, because we have, they've caused so many problems in other places, the Carolinas, New Jersey especially, where when you put up seawalls, eventually the sand in front of it just gets washed away and it never comes back. Here, because we're a south-facing shoreline, that's gonna tend not to be the case because the prevailing winds tend to push sand onto the beaches and rebuild our beaches. Even though they are gradually retreating over time, they do rebuild in the short term. They come and go from a certain spot. So with sea level rise and however that goes in the next few decades, that you could start to run into problems where that may not be the case anymore.
Like over time, the amount that is
The short-term
refeeding is
rebuilding, right, exactly,
enough.
right. If it needs to retreat like we seem to see that it does, over a century or so, if sea level rise is coming, then seawalls could become a problem where you'll stop getting that rebuilding. But or you might get much longer periods where the walls would be exposed. But, I mean, you don't have walls in most places, and they're not gonna build any right now. On the bay, it's another story because that's really complicated because those beaches don't rebuild naturally. And when somebody puts in a seawall, if there's a place where there's exacerbated erosion like you have in Lazy Point, and they put in a seawall, that is never gonna not be a seawall unless, there's some massive beach nourishment done in the bays, which has never been done. It's been talked about, but it's never been done. And so that's a really sticky one, and that particular property in Amagansett, Lazy Point, is one where they got an emergency permit to put it up, but it was supposed to be temporary. And they've refused to take it out because they say that the threat still, is looming over their house. But the neighbors are mad, and the town's environmental program that says, you're not allowed to have that there is opposed to allowing it to remain. They have applied to the town for a variance from the rule that says no seawalls to allow them to build one, saying that, there's no other choice otherwise their house is lost. And listen, property rights in America are still sort of tantamount, so judges are hard to convince otherwise.
To defend the town's position.
Yeah, judges have sided with homeowners a lot in those kind of things. I mean, it depends on
Like
who
in
you
the
get.
Carolinas and stuff, or?
In New York, I mean, there's a lot of properties with seawalls that were because they sued the town that told them they couldn't have one, and a judge said, no, you can have one, you have to be able to. That's how that one at the end of Flying Point Road, that was a judge saying, sorry, Southampton Town trustees, you can't tell them that they can't have a seawall, they get to have one, because otherwise their property is gonna be destroyed. And there's ways around that, there's a lot of people that think that, the groins idea is not the worst thing, that, they got.
To like evenly space them out
Yeah,
along.
to just have groins like they did in the West Hampton Dunes thing is sort of this dark history of that. And, but, and they sued and got, tens of millions of dollars worth of beach nourishment that's maintained their beach now since the early nineties and will for another 30 years. And, they say that if you had put those groins, the problem with the groins was that they stopped building them. And that if you had kept building groins and if you managed them properly, they would protect a shoreline. But, it interrupts the natural flow of things, and there's a whole community in the environmental and scientific world that says you need to just let nature do what it's gonna do, and we have to adapt, which means, eventually we would have to move houses and buildings off the coastline, and that's a hard thing to convince somebody to do.
Yeah, and it's a complicated issue. I mean, I know in like on the outer barrier islands in North Carolina.
Yeah, they're doing it there, and they're doing it in Jersey, in the wake of Sandy, they've done it in Jersey, but, it's basically just, you gotta throw billions and billions of dollars at it and just buy those people out.
But that's what's crazy. Like some of these projects, I think the New York Times did a whole thing on the outer barrier ones, and it was like they pay like tens of millions just to plow sand off the road to
Oh,
like
yeah.
keep the road there. But then they like rebuilt the house, and then the house like 3 years later. Like I don't think we're as at risk as other places,
Right, well, cause again, we do have that beach that sort of, if you go several years without a hurricane, the beaches tend to get back, or without a bad winter, the beaches tend to build up, and if you get lucky and a hurricane comes, then you've got a little bit of a buffer. And that's why, I mean, like you said, people spending the money, that's why, after Sandy, those homeowners, I think it was 125 homeowners in Sagaponack and Bridgehampton and a little bit of Watermill, paid $26 million just themselves. They just bucked up 26 million to do a beach nourishment project and build their beaches, because they were all spending $40,000 a year to truck in sand and pour it in front of their houses so that they would have a dune when the next storm came. And so they said, well, that's no problem. I think Ivor Rennert pays $350,000 a year just for his part of that 10-year thing.
Sounds like a
There's
great
a bunch
New
of
York Post
homeowners who
scoop.
pay $80,000, $100,000 a year just for their annual tax. They're taxing themselves for 10 years. I think it's up next year, and they're gonna do it again. They're just gonna re-up and do another one when the federal, FIMP project comes along. For the other places, they're gonna piggyback on that and put another $25 million worth of sand on the beach in front of their houses again.
On like almost like a homeowners association group.
Yep, that's what they created, they had to, by law, they had to create a taxing district, an erosion control district that gave Southampton Town the power to tax them. So the town went out and borrowed the money to pay for the project to get done, and then taxes those homeowners to pay that back over 10 years.
That's a really interesting model. Do you think that'll spread?
Well,
Like-
they've been trying to spread it. I mean, they do it in West Hampton Dunes. And they don't even pay, but they're doing it already so that when the federal funding of rebuilding their
From
beaches
Sandy.
runs out. Well, it was actually, they had won a lawsuit in the 90s after all those houses were destroyed, like 100 houses were destroyed in West Hampton Dunes, and they sued, they incorporated, they made a village. and they sued Suffolk County, blaming the jetty, the groins, for having caused that, and they won in court, and the court said, yes, Suffolk County and the Army Corps of Engineers who built those groins has to rebuild that beach, and they have to maintain it for 30 years. That'll be up soon. Actually might have been up last year, but now FIMP has taken over, and that's another 30 years of maintaining that beach. But they're already taxing themselves to save money for erosion control work when that runs out. There was an effort in Quogue to get a bunch of homeowners to sign on to creating an erosion control district, like homeowners in East Quogue did, and that's the same kind of thing. Now, they're gonna get money from FIMP, but they wanna have it ready if they need to do it on their own, or if they wanna augment it, and they're talking about doing that in Montauk. The town is talking about an erosion control district, because now you're gonna have FIMP putting in sand every 4 years. And they wanna maybe extend how far it goes or increase the amount of sand. And they would have to come up with a way to tax to do that, which, I mean, Montauk obviously have a commercial district, so that's a whole nother calculation.
And that would be like after this current Army Corps of Engineer.
Yeah, or it would piggyback,
Separate.
it would go along with it, it would parallel it, it would probably sort of be an add-on to that, at least since FIMP is gonna, which is Fire Island to Montauk Point Reformulation.
I was wondering,
And
what
that's-
I was
yeah,
like,
yeah,
I don't
sorry,
know about
sorry,
this
yeah, sorry.
acronym. You're
Yeah,
in
that's
the.
been
weeds
around
of
for 60 years. I've written easily 100 stories about FIMP, and then it sort of was just, it was this grand plan for how to rebuild the beaches and storm-proof Long Island that the Army Corps had just had on a shelf and never had been funded, and then Sandy happened, and everybody was looking for a way to keep such damage from happening again. They said, well, we have this plan. So they took it off the shelf. They said, okay, good, here's $1 billion. Do that. And now it's up to 2 billion, and they're actually gonna do it. They started last year on Fire Island, and they're gonna do it this winter in Montauk. And it's gonna be, it's interesting. It's not without its critics. Kevin McAllister is definitely watching this, and we'll be the first to stand up and say beach nourishment is not the answer, but it's a
because
Band-Aid for now.
it's changing the ecosystem.
It's also not sustainable. Beach nourishment is how Florida has maintained their beaches for decades, and now they're out of sand, and so they can't do it anymore.
I've heard
Or-
sand is really expensive right now.
It's super expensive because of all these projects.
Oh.
And because it's running out, and so now you're having to truck it in, like in Florida, they're literally mining it in the middle of the state and trucking it to a beach in just north of Jupiter, Bathtub Beach, which is a great fishing spot. I've been there a couple of times. And they truck it in, hundreds of thousands of tons of sand every year, and dump it on this beach, and it just gets washed away like instantly, because it's another beach that's caught between two groins, and it's just in a terrible place that the sand doesn't stay. And so it's not sustainable. They're talking about buying it from the Bahamas now, which creates all these other constitutional issues and Jones Act laws and.
Wow, I think
problems.
speaking of another article idea, I think someone should write about the sand thing. 'Cause I've been seeing it, I've been doing a lot of reporting on kelp, and people are trying to figure out how to like make seaweed concrete. It's very early stages, like no one really knows how to do it that well because it's very salty. So you have to like remove the salt, and it's not like economically, it's not worth it.
Yeah, you need a lot of seaweed.
A lot of seaweed, and you have to process it and then mix it in with the kelp, and the way that it's working, it's like not working well with the chemistry. But anyways, hopefully, because of the sand being so expensive, they're thinking that kelpcrete could be economically like a good option
Right,
in the future.
right.
But the sand,
That's right, yeah, concrete's a big reason that sand's so expensive too, because of development.
yeah.
Boom. over
But
the last-
I always find it fascinating when there's like that one thing that makes everything else like more expensive, or
Yeah.
something that you
There's
don't
been,
consider.
there's a bunch of great articles out there, some real deep dive pieces. I think the Times or the Washington Post and Vanity Fair have done stories
about the sand.
just about the price of sand and how much it is. It is just bonkers expensive nowadays.
Wow, well, we're just
People
so wealthy out
like to
here.
the extent that people are stealing it, actually.
Really?
Yep, going in and like siphoning sand off of other beaches and excavating it out of places, just like they steal copper cutters around here, that kind of a thing.
That's a fun idea. Following the sand stealers, I mean.
Yeah.
And then, so looking into the winter, what are the kind of fish that you're excited about?
Well, we don't have cod fishing in the winter anymore. That used to be our winter thing. There's good black sea bass fishing all the way till December 31st. There's a bunch of, local party boats that'll go do that, and that's a great one because they're so delicious and you can catch them, till late in the year. So they're a big freezer filler for a lot of people. And black fishing goes almost all the way to Christmas, and that stays good. So there's still fishing to do, and then, waterfowling season for outdoors people and deer hunting and that sort of thing. So. But yeah, fishing is in the winter is not what it used to be. It, like I mentioned, when I worked on the Viking, and I just worked there in the summer, I was in high school and on weekends when I was in high school, and then when I went to college. But the other people that worked on the Viking, their real career, their business season, their money making season was in the wintertime, going cod fishing because. They had, so many boats going, and they would make so much money in tips, filleting fish, and that was really the height of their season because the cod fishing was so good. And literally in the winter of 1991, 92, it just completely collapsed, and there was no fishing, and the Viking boat stopped cod fishing for decades after that. And had a little bit of a renaissance in like 2009, 10, 11 when the cod fishing just off Block Island was really good for a while, but then that went away, and they came back a little bit about 5-6 years ago, but hasn't lasted. That stock has just never been able to rebound from the massive overfishing in the early 20th century, 19th century and early 20th century mostly.
Yeah, that's one of I feel like I've read like historical documents about how much cod there were. It just seems incredible. I would have loved to
There's a great
see
book
it.
called Cod that was just the fish that changed the world because, Christopher Columbus and all that, but there were fishermen that were over here catching cod long before any pilgrims set foot on land in North America because cod were such an important fish and so incredibly abundant, and we just completely fished them to basic. I mean, they're basically non-existent. There is still a fishery. The fishing at Cox Ledge was pretty good this late summer and fall, but it's not it's not like it used to be.
So we don't end on a really sad note. What is your best fish that you've caught? It can be like most exciting, yeah.
Favorite? Oh boy, there's a few. Probably like 125-pound yellowfin that I caught all by myself in the middle of the night when I was working as a mate for the Entenmans in the early 90s, when everybody else had gone to bed and I was just up catching fish. And which was shortly followed by one of my other favorite stories where there was the owner's daughter had 4 of her friends. They had all just graduated from grad school, and they came along, and this one guy apparently had gotten seasick as soon as we left the dock, and I had never seen him the entire time, and I was up catching fish all by myself, and he comes out of the cabin to throw up over the side of the boat. And I literally thought to myself, who is that guy? And one of the rods got bit right then. And I said, feel like catching a fish? And he said, sure. And he sat down in the chair, and I put the rod in between his legs and the thing, and he caught another 100+ pound yellowfin tuna, which was spectacular. And got up and went back into the cabin, and I never saw him again until we got back to the dock. And that was a great trip with Jeff Dixon and Jackie Entenman, and that would have been probably the summer of 1993 or 4. George Pataki had just been elected because they all worked on his campaign. I can't remember when it was, but
George Pataki's campaign time.
Right. Well, he was governor then. He had been elected. They had been in grad school, and then when they had finished, they had gone to work for his campaign that fall, and so then that it was that following summer. So yeah, that tuna was maybe one of my favorites, but there's been a lot.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, my pleasure.
And thank you for sharing all your great fishing stories.
Yeah, great. Keep up the good work. I love what you guys are doing.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.